As we finish up with our exploration of the topic of reason in September, it seemed really important to talk about the fact that we human beings are not as logical and rational as we think. This fact, though uncomfortable, does go a long way in explaining some of the trouble our world is in right now. It's also important to note that everyone is susceptible to having their powers of reason hijacked. My words today are based on an article from the author Mark Manson. It's called Why You Can't Trust Yourself. Even when you think you know for sure, think again. And in it, he gives 8 psychology-based reasons why we humans should not trust our own judgment. It appears that we have lots of blind spots, lots of things we do not see. One blind spot that gets in our way of our ability to use our powers of reason is something called the actor-observer bias. It has a pretty professional sounding name, but it's something I think everyone can relate to. And here's how it works. Let's say you're driving and you're at an intersection and someone runs a red light. Now, you'll probably have some pretty bad thoughts about this person. You'll think they're careless and horrible and they're putting the lives of others at risk, in danger, just because they're in a hurry to get somewhere, probably for no good reason. But if you are the one who runs that red light, you won't be nearly as hard on yourself as you are on another person. You'll justify it in your head. It was an innocent mistake. The visibility was poor, and no one got hurt. When it comes to undesirable behavior, we tend to be a lot harder on everyone else than we are on ourselves. Not very rational, is it? Now, this tendency to be more forgiving of ourselves than others really shows up in times of conflict. When people talk about someone who has upset them or hurt their feelings, they often ascribe all sorts of negative qualities to this person and to their actual intentions. They see acts of cruelty motivated by malicious intent to inflict suffering. But when people talk about the times they have hurt someone, they come up with a lot of justifications and good reasons for their behavior. And it turns out that both of these extreme views are wrong. Psychologists have found that both the people doing harm and the victims distort the facts. Author Steven Pinker calls this the moralization gap. When in conflict, we overestimate our good intentions and underestimate the intentions of others. And we do this unconsciously. We have no idea when it's happening that our thinking is distorted. We human beings also behave irrationally when it comes to seeking happiness. Now, months ago, I did a sermon series on how to find happiness, and half the course was about the mythology, about the falsehoods we believe about happiness. So one of the major points of this course was that the things we think will make us happy usually do not. We're seeking happiness in the wrong place. Human reason and logic is not helpful at all when it comes to seeking happiness. And although we are rational, thoughtful human beings, we also underestimate our ability to be manipulated. So I'm wondering, did anyone ever receive a mailing from a charity that included a free gift inside? Like a lot of times you get the ones with the return address labels, which are kind of useful actually. It's not a bad gift to receive. Once I think I even received one that had an actual nickel kind of glued inside. So why do charities do this? Well, it turns out that direct mail solicitations for charities is something that is tested and studied. They send out all sorts of different mailings and then track which ones perform the best, then do more of that type of thing. And studies have shown that giving a free gift in a mail solicitation will result in a higher number of people sending back a donation. What this does, it plays on our unconscious need to reciprocate after receiving a gift. We can also be manipulated in other subtle ways when it comes to shopping. behavioral economists have shown that you can easily be primed into favoring one price point over another for no particular reason. For example, if you have 2 bottles of wine that are pretty similar on the store shelf, and one is priced at $10 and the other one is priced at $30, the buyer will most likely go for the cheaper $10 option. Now, if you take this same display and you add a 3rd bottle of wine at the $50 price point, and they're all together $10, $30, $50, now the consumer is not as likely to get the $10 bottle. They're going to pick the $30 bottle just because the $30 bottle seems more reasonable in comparison to the 10, because it's right in the middle between the 10 and the 50. You add the 50, $30 doesn't seem as bad as it did when there was no $50 bottle. This is the kind of irrational choices we make all the time, and there are tons of illustrations out there on how we can be manipulated into being less than logical. Now, in our current era of fake news and constant misinformation, there's another human limitation that is particularly relevant in this time. We are much more likely to believe the things that support our existing opinions and viewpoints, much more than actually believing things that challenge our existing perspective. This is called confirmation bias. And you can see how it plays out in our world. You can see how it plays out on social media. Really, my friends on social media, most of them agree with me on just about everything, especially everything political, right? So one way I also think that this is one we know about, right? We realize that when we get emotional, we're not always going to behave rationally, right? We all know this to a certain extent, that our feelings can get in the way of our ability to reason. But yet our emotions really do have more of an ability than what we think to change our own perceptions. Like, we're all aware that we shouldn't make big decisions or confront people or send that email message when our emotions are running wild. But unfortunately, the effects of our emotions last longer than we think, long after we think that emotion has subsided. Emotions we believe that are in the past still can influence our decisions days, weeks, and even months later. Studies have even shown that milder emotions and shorter lasting emotions can have long-term impacts on our future decision-making. We often make current decisions based on past experiences and emotions without even knowing we're doing that. When it comes to using our human memories, people can also be kind of irrational. Our memories are very imperfect and flawed. Research has found that our memories of past events are easily confused with other past experiences. They can also be confused by adding new, incorrect information. Yes, our memories can change over time. With time, our memories not only fade, but they become more susceptible to false information finding their way into that memory. You might remember when the news anchor Brian Williams got himself into a lot of trouble. He shared that a helicopter he was on in Iraq was fired upon. But yet it was proven that the helicopter he was in was not fired upon. That part of the story was completely untrue. He eventually apologized for conflating 2 separate events in his mind. One was that he was in the helicopter that was not fired upon, but helicopters with them were, and he also had a memory of seeing one of the helicopters that had been shot down or forced to land and inspecting that after he landed from the helicopter that was not fired upon. He also made a reference to the fuzziness of a memory being 12 years old. Now, some thought he was just being self-aggrandizing, that he was just trying to make himself look like a hero or a tough guy. But I think there is a case to believe that his memory, after probably lots of traumatic events in war zones, that his mind actually did change the facts for him. Even worse than this fuzziness of memories we have, the fact is that we can actually have whole, completely false memories planted in our heads. and this isn't done by any sophisticated brainwashing technique. We're most susceptible to having false memories implanted in us when they're being planted by family members and other people we trust. So if your sibling says, "Don't you remember about this thing we did when we were kids?" and you're pretty sure you didn't do that thing, you probably should not believe them, because chances are they might be talking about something they did with a friend and not their sibling. These things happen all the time where people pick up these memories that are not necessarily their own or true. So why are our brains so bad at memory? Well, they're not wired to be like computers. They're not wired just to hold all the facts and all the details of situations. Our memories are a lot more selective than that because they have a different kind of purpose. Our memories are mostly about maintaining an identity and a sense of who we are. And this is what allows us to function in our complex lives. I mean, I think we've all seen those movies about an amnesiac who wakes up every day not knowing who they are and not remembering anything, and what a horrible way to live that is. You know, having to start from scratch every day about who you are, where you are, what's going on, right? That's what our memory does for us. It keeps us from that disorientation of having to live a life brand new every single day. So our memories help us build and maintain our identities by giving us stories of our past. And 100% factual accuracy doesn't really matter for these particular purposes, for these stories that give us our identity. All that matters is that we have a story of our past in our heads that creates a sense of who we are, our sense of self. So we retain these fuzzy memories, and then we actually just go back and fill in the details to fit the version of ourself we have come to understand. We adapt our memories without knowing it. We exaggerate them or minimize them or change some details to reinforce the stories we create about ourselves in our minds. So that's why multiple witnesses to the same crime will come up with some very different accounts of what actually happened. Everyone is using a different mental filter, and we are really not wired to notice all of the details of a situation. Now, perhaps the scariest part is that the sense of identity we build in our minds using questionable versions of memories and experiences, it really doesn't exist in any reality beyond our own minds. These stories that create our identities are really nothing that is truly based in reality. Our minds are full of made-up stories based on a minimum of facts for which we have just filled in the blanks. And this is why people go to therapy and they go to counseling, to get a reality check on all of the untrue or exaggerated stories our brains are telling us about ourselves and our lives. We really are not as rational as we think. So even though we do all of this strange stuff with memory to maintain a sense of self, it also appears that the sense of self can be called into question. It appears that the idea of the core self, that's the self that you see as unchanging and permanent, right? That type of self. Science is finding out that that is simply an illusion. Research psychology is telling us that. We don't have an unchanging, permanent self. It just doesn't work that way. Now, people who have done psychedelic drugs, they know this already, right? The self is not a permanent thing. But without psychedelic drugs, the Buddhists actually figured this out thousands of years ago. They found that the self is simply a construct. And it's a construct that if you buy into the idea of the self too much, it can make you really, really miserable. It appears that modern science is actually validating this ancient self-help advice about the idea of self, when it's too exaggerated, can really get you into trouble. So in this era of toxic independence, I'm really starting to see the harm that can be done by those with a very rigid concept of self. After all, you can't have a self without having an other. And that's where all the problems begin. I am this, you are that. You know, that's where every argument begins. And the worship of the self, self-worship, really appears to be at the root of so many problems. When you hear people screaming about their rights, their choice, their this, their that, and not thinking about the impact they have on the greater whole, right? That's a problem. So maybe we just need to get over ourselves and, like the Buddhists recommend, work to recognize the thing called the no self. So now that we know our sense of self is not based on anything particularly real, we might as well go ahead and just blow up the rest of our so-called reality. In fact, our physical experience of the world isn't particularly real either. At least it's very limited. And this is because our brains have limitations. Our senses have limitations. So there is a lot out there that we are simply missing all the time. The light human beings are able to see is only a tiny band of the electromagnetic spectrum. Birds and insects can see parts of light that we cannot. And of course, we know that dogs can hear and smell things we do not even know are there. It turns out that our conscious minds only handle about 60 bits of information per second when we're actively using our brains. So at best, we're only consciously aware of about the tiniest sliver, much less than 1% of the information that our brains are receiving. So there is a lot out there that never makes it into our awareness. So we just don't know what we don't know. And that not knowing of what we don't know brings us to a concept called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which is another type of cognitive bias. In this one, people believe that they are smarter and more capable than they really are. Essentially, low ability people do not possess the skills needed to recognize their own incompetence. The combination of poor self-awareness and low cognitive ability leads them to overestimate their own capabilities. In essence, they don't know what they don't know. A person can be really bad at something and have no idea they're so bad at it. And you can see how this tendency can be dangerous. An anti-vaxxer who doesn't understand the scientific method because they don't know the scientific method exists may wonder why CDC recommendations are changing and might suspect this apparent indecision is incompetence or conspiracy when it's just the scientific method playing out with new information. Now you take this same person and expose them to some misinformation on social media, this person who has no frame under which to discern what is true by science and what is not, they'll buy into the misinformation. And that's a pretty insidious thing that is happening. But before we all pat ourselves on our backs about being intelligent, educated people who are very reasonable and won't fall for anything like that, it turns out we are not immune to this either, because the Dunning-Kruger effect goes well beyond book smarts. People can also overestimate their emotional awareness and their emotional intelligence. They can be insensitive and practice behaviors that ruin human relationships. And all the time, they have no idea of their incompetence in this area. I once heard a story about a man who was divorced 7 times. And he kept telling his friends that women are just so hard to get along with. I suspect he was failing to realize that his own relation skills left something to be desired. He just didn't know what he didn't know. Researchers have found that people who rank the lowest on emotional intelligence tests somehow think they are far more emotionally aware than other people. They were also less likely to want feedback regarding their low scores or resources to help improve them. They don't want to know what they don't know. Going on, people with the unhealthiest lifestyles rate themselves as much healthier than they are. People who score poorly on cognitive reasoning tests severely overestimate their cognitive abilities, while the people who score highly underestimate their performance. So you score low, but you overestimate your abilities, and you score high, but then you underestimate your abilities. And people who hold the most politically biased views, that's biased in any different direction, also hold the most factually inaccurate beliefs. So it seems like the more extremist you are about anything, the more likely you are to believe things that support your extremism that aren't necessarily true. So the author Mark Manson says, you can't reason with a conspiracy theorist precisely because they don't form their beliefs with reason. If they had the ability to change their beliefs based on reason and evidence, they wouldn't have believed in wild conspiracy theories in the first place. In fact, they think they're the only ones being reasonable to begin with. So part of the problem here is that people derive feelings of comfort from a sense of knowing things. But it doesn't matter whether the things you think you know are correct or not in order to get that sense of comfort from knowing. People also tend to be very uncomfortable with uncertainty. I'm sure this anxiety coming from uncertainty about the pandemic has driven a lot of people into believing the strangest things just in search of some anxiety-relieving certainty. When you have that sense of certainty, you feel safe. And that feeling of safety doesn't care if what you're believing to feel safe is actually true or not. It's all about getting relief from this fear of not knowing. Now, researchers, unfortunately, have not found any perfect solutions for any of these conditions that make people tend to believe in things that are not true. But there are some promising ideas, especially when it comes to dealing with the Dunning-Kruger effect. And they're very indirect solutions. One possible solution is to get people to develop related skills to reduce their blind spots. So if someone is bad at accounting, you don't tell them they're bad at accounting. Perhaps you reach out and teach them organizational skills so that in the process of learning how to be better organized in their paperwork and transactions, they themselves come to realize that they have no natural talent at accounting. So that's kind of hitting it from the side there. And just simply teaching people about human blind spots, the human tendency to have blind spots, and the Dunning-Kruger effect may also be helpful in the hope that people, once they're aware that these effects happen, they might start questioning their own assumptions a little bit more. So these approaches are indirect and gentle because, as you can guess, bluntness is counterproductive. It makes people defensive, and they basically just double down on their existing beliefs. And it is possibly gently to nudge someone into seeing a blind spot. If someone is overly confident in a certain area of life, you could expose them to actual experts, examples of particular excellence in that area, so they start to develop a frame of reference for their own abilities or inabilities. This may not work, or they might slowly catch on eventually. But the thing we ultimately have control over is ourselves. Mark Manson says the only way to ward off your own ignorance is by choosing to have fewer opinions and more loosely held beliefs rather than rigidly held ones. He says that approaching life with a sense of humility is also helpful in countering the Dunning-Kruger effect. By intentionally underestimating our own understanding of things, not only do we open up to more opportunities to learn and grow, we also foster a more realistic view of ourselves. I might also add with humility, we are a lot less annoying to our friends. I think there's some really good conclusions here to all of these troubling things for Unitarian Universalists, some advice we can take from all of this. I think we should really continue to be curious about the world and be willing to learn more, willing to consider things from numerous points of view, to listen deeply to others, especially when we don't particularly like what they have to say. Let's not get too in love with our own personal opinions. There is always more out there. There is so much out there that we are not seeing. And if you find yourself being so confident in your knowledge of something, take that as a sign to check yourself. Go back and review. and find out if that intense confidence is truly justified. This practice of humility will not only ensure we keep learning and keep our minds open, it will actually serve us better in our efforts to influence others. So maybe, just maybe, if we can embody and practice all these qualities like humility and openness, we might be able to make a difference in our very confused and very unreasonable world. May it be so, and blessed be.